In July 1962, theaters across India were filled for the release of a high-profile new drama. But as the film reached its conclusion, the atmosphere in the audience shifted from anticipation to open hostility. Viewers weren't just uncomfortable, they were vocal in their rejection of the story's final moments. The source of the anger was a single scene. A married Hindu woman sits in a horse-drawn carriage, resting her head in the lap of a man who is not her husband. Looking up at him, she makes a final, desperate request for one last sip of alcohol. The backlash was immediate and damaging. To protect the film's commercial life, the director was forced to recall the prince, rewrite the ending, and cut an entire musical sequence to satisfy the censors and the public. This was Sahib Bibi Aur Ghulam, Master, Wife, and Slave. It arrived in theaters depicting the internal lives of women with a clinical, unflinching honesty that broke every established rule of Indian commercial cinema. To understand why a 1962 audience found this woman so threatening, we have to examine the rigid, aristocratic cage she was trying to dismantle from within. The setting is early 20th century Calcutta. The city is a hub of colonial trade, defined by a massive gap between a rising middle class and an entrenched, wealthy aristocracy. At the heart of this world is the Haveli, a fortified mansion owned by the zamindars, or feudal landlords. These families live by ancient, rigid codes of conduct that prioritize pride and lineage over almost everything else. The master of this house, known as Chhoti Bahu, lives a life of absolute decadence. He spends his nights at the local brothels, squandering the family's coal money on courtesans and liquor, returning home only to sleep through the daylight hours. Locked inside the women's quarters is his wife, Chhoti Bahu. She is adorned in the heavy gold and silk of a high-status spouse, yet she is forbidden from leaving the estate or even speaking to her husband unless he chooses to visit her. While the other women in the household accept their role as silent, ornamental trophies, Chhoti Bahu decides to fight back. She chooses to violate the social codes of the Haveli to reclaim her husband's attention. Her struggle is witnessed by Bhutnath, a naive rural migrant who arrives at the mansion looking for work. As he moves through the estate's corridors, he becomes a reluctant confidant to the wife's growing desperation. Bhutnath finds work at a factory making Mohini Sindoor, a purported magical powder meant to secure a husband's love. Chhoti Bahu uses Bhutnath to smuggle this powder into her quarters, hoping a supernatural fix will save her marriage. When the magic powder fails, she confronts her husband directly, begging him to stay home. His response is a cruel, cynical ultimatum. He tells her that he has no interest in a virtuous wife. If she wants him to stay in her bed, she must drink with him, sing for him, and behave like the courtesans he pays for in the city. The tragedy of the trap is absolute. To fulfill her duty as a devoted wife, her husband demands that she completely abandon the moral standards that define a good woman in her society.
Chhoti Bahu accepts the terms. She begins to drink heavily to please her husband, crossing a line that marks her as an outcast in her own home. She secures his presence, but at the cost of her health and her sanity. This self-destruction occurs just as a new India is rising outside the walls. This world is represented by Jaba, an educated working woman who lives with independence, a freedom Chhoti Bahu can't even imagine. The decay within the mansion eventually turns physical. Chhoti Bahu is caught in a violent brawl at a brothel, leaving him permanently paralyzed and ending his nights of debauchery forever. Simultaneously, the family's wealth evaporates. The zamindars, incapable of managing modern business, lose their fortune to failed investments in industrialized coal mines. The feudal world is being replaced by an industrial one. Left with a paralyzed husband and a bankrupt estate, Chhoti Bahu is abandoned. She becomes a broken alcoholic, wandering the ruins of the life she tried so hard to preserve. Her individual collapse is the final stage of the Haveli's history. As the financial foundations of the zamindar class crumbled, the women they sequestered were the first to be crushed by the debris. The film moves into its present-day timeline. Bhutnath is now a successful architect, a man of the New World tasked with clearing the path for progress. He returns to the ruined Haveli, overseeing a crew crushing the ornate bricks into dust to make room for a modern project.
During the demolition, the workers strike something solid in the foundation. They pull back the earth to reveal a human skeleton, buried secretly beneath the floorboards. Bhutnath examines the remains. On the skeleton's wrist, he finds a specific bangle, the same one he saw Chhoti Bahu wearing decades earlier.
He realizes that when the mansion's power finally failed, the family's last act was to hide the evidence of her existence. This discovery brings Bhutnath and the viewer to a sudden, violent realization about the true human cost of the aristocratic traditions he is now tearing down. The rotting, buried skeleton is the final residue of the zamindari system. It is the physical proof that this entire social order was built on the concealment and destruction of its women. It shows a feudal institution that was hollow at its core, a structure that eventually collapsed and buried those it claimed to protect. This context explains the 1962 audience backlash. The public watched a husband demand his wife drink, only to then watch that same society condemn her for complying. When viewers rejected the ending, they were reacting to a story showing a woman following orders, only to be entirely destroyed. Meena Kumari's performance as Chhoti Bahu humanized this tragedy, making the character's addiction feel like a rational response to an irrational world. Her portrayal allowed the film to survive, despite the initial attempts to silence it. Sahib Bibi Aur Ghulam remains a vital work of cinema because it refuses to look away from the cost of the past. It depicts a society that forced its women into a choice between total invisibility and absolute self-destruction.